Okay, so we're gonna do some more practice with the normal distribution. I know we went over how to do it last class, but these questions get really tricky. And as we'll branch off after doing this warm up today, but these questions do get a lot harder than well, they are right now. So what I've done is I have copied and pasted the instructions for the normal distribution on here, so you have like a little cheat sheet instead of looking at your notes from last time. But one thing that I noticed in my last class is I made a mistake writing up these directions. Okay, if you're dealing with a z-score, the mean's going to be 0, but the standard deviation isn't going to be 0. It's going to be 1. Okay, so just change that standard deviation to 1 on the directions instead of 0, because that is not correct. Okay. And basically you're following these directions, right? So whenever you're asked to find a probability, you basically have to follow the directions, and it's really easy if you're trying to find a less than probability, right? If it's a less than probability, the Minitab output is, well, the answer, right? So you don't have to do anything. Then we had, okay, what if we want to find a between probability? That's really easy. You just do Minitab for both of the numbers and then subtract them, right? So subtract the two numbers. The hardest one is if you're given a bigger than probability, so you're trying to find the area to the right. If you do that, then remember, you do Minitab and you do 1 minus the answer. So there's basically like 3 different types of questions in this section, right? Less than, greater than, and in between. And you do a different thing for each time. Okay. Now, if you're given an X value, you have to type in the X mean and standard deviation in the question. If you're given a Z-score, the mean is 0 and the standard deviation is 1. Okay, why don't we do some practice actually doing this on our computers? I know you watched me in class last time, but I think watching me doesn't really do anything. So why don't we do this? In our warm-up, we have a question about the length of pregnancy from conception to birth, normally distributed with a mean of 272 and a standard deviation of 9. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions for you. What I want you to do is, well, why don't we do the first one together and then I can let you on your own for the last 4. Okay. So this question's asking what proportion of pregnancies last less than 259 days? Before I do a question, I always like to draw a picture of the normal distribution or the bell curve, just because, well, it kind of helps me like visualize what's actually going on here. Okay. So if I'm asked about the proportion of pregnancies that last less than 259 days, it's not telling me that 259 is a z-score. It's literally telling me that 259 is an actual data value. So this is actually an X value, which means, well, I actually have to use the mean and standard deviation in the question. So if we're dealing with an X value, the mean is always in the middle, that's 272. The standard deviation is always going to be 9, okay? And I'm just going to mark 259 on my plot. So it looks like 259 might be, I don't know, somewhere below the mean. So here. And if I'm doing a less than question, I'm going to shade in everything to the left, right? So this is what I'm shading in. Okay. Once I have this visual, I can go on Minitab and follow the instructions here. Okay. So let me just show you what I do on Minitab here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Minitab. Okay. Oh, my session has expired. Oh my goodness. Here we go. Okay. Remember, to get to the probabilities, you're going to click on Calc. You're going to go to probability distributions. Okay. We haven't talked about the middle one. The bottom one was about binomial distribution. We're going to click the top one that says cumulative. So click cumulative. And then we get this. Okay. Basically, what you do is you keep everything the same, except you might want to change the mean and standard deviation. And then the value is the value you're interested in. So if we want to know less than 259, I'm writing 259 here. Okay. Since we have a question where the mean and standard deviation is different and we're dealing with an X value, I've got to change my mean to the mean in the question, 272, and the standard deviation to 9. Once I've done typing that in, I'm just going to click OK. And it tells me what I typed in 259, and to the right, it gives me the probability 0.0743. All right, so on my paper, what I'll do, 2, 1, okay. On my paper, what I'll do is I'll write the Minitab output. So Minitab said 0.074. And if it's a less than probability, do I have to do anything to this number? No, right? That's literally the answer. That's it. All right. Okay, if we don't have any questions on part A, if you flip to the next page, I have a set of 4 more questions for you to try. Give these a shot. I'll be around to see if you're on the right track and answer any questions, and we'll come back in a little bit. All right, how about this? If you're still working, you can zoom me out. I'm going to go over some of these in detail because we do have some people on Zoom. So if you're still working, keep working. And then if you're not, then pay attention to me. Okay, so for part B, this one wanted to know the proportion of pregnancies that have a z-score that's less than 0.2. So this time we're asked for a z-score, not an x value, which means, okay, we're not dealing with the mean and standard deviation in our question. Our mean and standard deviation is going to be 0 and 1, right? That's what we do when we have a z-score. Okay. Well, if the z-score is talking about 0.2, that's a little bit higher than 0. And it's a less than probability, so I guess I'm shading in everything to the left. Okay, so what you want to do is you go on Minitab, you click through all the options, and 0.2 goes in your value box, and you change the mean and standard deviation to 0 and 1 to tell Minitab you're dealing with a z-score and not a regular x value. Okay, what was the Minitab output? Perfect, 0.579. Okay, I'm gonna add a 3 on top of it. All right, so this is our Minitab score. This is a less than probability, so is that our answer? Yep, that's it. So 0.75793 was your answer. That's it. All right, for part C, we wanted to find the proportion of pregnancies that last longer than 259 days. This time we're not told that it's a z-score, so this is definitely an x value. Okay, which means we're switching back from the mean and standard deviation of 0 and 1 to the mean of 272 and the standard deviation of 9. Okay, well, 259 is less than 272, so if I drew a picture, it'd probably be around here. Okay, and now we're asked about lasting longer, not lasting less. So I guess we have to shade in the area to the right. Okay, well, that doesn't change what we're typing into Minitab. On Minitab, we have to on Minitab, we have to type in 259 as our value, our mean as 272, our standard deviation of 9. If you type this on Minitab, you should have gotten 0.074. Is that our final answer? No, right? Because this is a longer than question, which means we have to do something else. What do we have to do? Yep, subtract by 1, right? So if it's a longer than question, just do 1 minus 0.074, and 0.926 should have been your answer. All right. Moving on to part D, we know a pregnancy is full term if it's between 252 and 298 days. These are definitely X values because first of all, they're in the 200s and it doesn't say it's a Z-score. So going back to our picture, I know that the mean is 272. 252 is a little bit below 272, so I'm going to draw it to the left. 298 is a little bit above 272, so I'll draw it to the right. And this time we're trying to find in between. Okay, so whenever we do in between probabilities, we go on Minitab and we type in everything for 252, and you should have gotten something like 0.0131. You would do the same thing for 298 and get the 0.9981. And then what do you do with those two probabilities? Subtract them, right? So to get our final answer, we do 0.9981 minus 0.0131, and we get 0.985. And that's it. All right. Last one might be the easiest one. Part E, what's always the answer for exact probabilities? It's always going to be 0, right? Cumulative probability distribution doesn't work with exact probabilities. I know it sounds weird that like the probability of exactly 273, it should be something, but based on what Minitab gives us, it's the area underneath the curve. If something doesn't have any width, you can't really find its area. The answer is always going to be 0. All right. Any questions on the warm-up? I think we are dead set good on finding these probabilities. Let's do something a little different. Okay. Now, so far, the questions that we have been given is let me write this out. So far what we've been doing is we've been given a question that, so the question tells us either an X value or a Z score, right? The X value or a Z score. And then it asks us, okay, what's the probability? That's the question, right? So what's the probability? Okay, what we're going to do this time is, well, the question. Now what we're going to do, I'm going to give you a question that tells us the probability. Yeah, and guess what we're going to have to find? We're going to have to find the X and the Z value, okay? What's the X, Z value? Okay, so in the question up top, we went on Minitab and we used the cumulative, forget exactly what it was called. It was the cumulative distribution function button. Okay, so it had the word cumulative in it, right? The button that we're going to use for the next set of questions is the inverse cumulative distribution. Okay, so basically what happens is if we're going forward using the cumulative button, if we're going backwards, we're using the inverse cumulative button. How we're going, yeah, we're going all directions now. Okay, so I have a bunch of steps for you to follow. I think it's good if like I'm not here telling you what to click, but this is for you to follow later on. Oh, here we go. Okay, here's the steps I want you to do. The first thing I want you to do, especially for the reverse questions, is to draw a picture, because it's very tough to get, well, it's very interesting to figure out what exactly you're doing if you don't draw it, okay? The second step is, if the given area is on the right, I want you to subtract it from 1. So we're doing the subtracting before we type anything in the Minitab. If we're doing an area on the left, then we don't have to do anything else, okay? Step 3, we're going to click through a bunch of stuff, type in our answers, and then whatever we get is actually our final answer. Let's just do an example and see what happens. Okay, so just a little reminder, if you're using the cumulative button, actually, no, I'm going to, why don't we just do the question? I'll remind you later on. Okay, here's our example. We want to find the Z-score. So this question isn't asking us what the probability is. They're actually telling us what the probabilities are in the question. We want to find the Z-scores that are associated with them. So what are the actual values that correlate with these probabilities? Okay, so we want to find the Z-score. Remember, a Z-score always has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, right? That's always true for Z-scores, okay? Well, I want to find an area of 0.9798 below. And based on the picture, I'm given an area that's shaded to the left. So it looks like Minitab can understand left questions. They're always good with below then questions. We don't have to do anything to that area before we do the question. So it looks like we're all set up. Okay, let me show you what you do if you want to do this question. So I'm just going to switch to Minitab real quick. Okay, you're going to click on Calc, Probability Distributions, and instead of the cumulative distribution function, we're going to go 1 down to the inverse cumulative distribution. Okay, so this tells us that we're going backwards. So something really familiar pops up. It's literally the same box, but we're typing in different numbers here. Okay, everything stays the same. The value isn't the X or Z value anymore. We're typing in the probability because that's what the question gives us. So the probability is 0.9798. 98. Okay, this is a z-score, so the mean is 0, standard deviation 1. Looks like that's all set. So I'm just going to click OK. And what pops up is a chart that gives me the value that I just typed in, and then the X value or z-score that it corresponds with. So this X value is 2.049, and that's my answer. All you have to do. So did everyone get the 2.049 if you followed through? Cool. All right. Now I hate switching between my screen and the question, but that's okay. We're getting there. All right. So the Minitab output was 2.04964. The Minitab output for these questions are always going to be your final answer. You don't have to do anything to the number once you get it on Minitab. Let's do part B. This time we're given like a similar question, but here we're doing a greater than probability instead of a less than. Now remember, Minitab hates anything that's not less than. If it's not shaded to the left, Minitab cannot figure out what the answer is because it's not very smart and you have to tell it exactly what to do, okay? So what we're gonna do is, why don't we transform this question into the last question, okay? So instead of figuring out what the area is to the right, because if I typed in that area, Minitab wouldn't process that, okay? Why don't we find the area to the left, okay? And let me do this in a different color. So I'm gonna find out the left area, okay? Well, how do I find that area? Perfect, subtract by 1. So before you do the question, step 1 is to take my probability and subtract it from 1, 0.9418. When I do 1 minus that, we get 0.0582, and that's the probability to the left, okay? So basically what we did is we transformed this question into the question in part A that we can just type in the new probability and find what z-score corresponds with that. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to Minitab. I'm going to type calc probability distributions, inverse. And then instead of the point whatever from the last question, I'm going to change it to the 0.0582. I'm going to click OK. And my z-score is negative 1.57. All right. Any questions on what I did here? All right. Let me show you what I'm writing on my screen here. All right. So basically, whatever pops up on Minitab is going to be your answer. So the negative 1.5701, that's our answer. Even though this is a greater than question, I don't have to do anything with my Minitab output because I already did it in my first step, right? So I've already subtracted it from 1. I don't need to do it again. Let's do one more question together. Example 2 talks about this community called Mensa. It's basically a bunch of people with like really high IQs, and you need a membership to go in it. So you have to prove that you have a high IQ. And in particular, they're in the top 2% of IQs. So they're like the top 2% smartest people in the world or whatever. Okay, so let's say the scores on an IQ test has a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So let me just draw that out for you. We have a normal distribution. The mean is 100 and the standard deviation is 15. Okay. This one's asking us, what's the minimum score that's needed to qualify to actually be in Mensa? Okay. Well, I know that Mensa is in the top 2%. And if it's the top anything, I guess that means like whatever's on the right, right? So I'm looking for the area to the right that represents the top 2%. Okay, now I don't like percentages. I think the textbook just doesn't use them that much, which is why I don't really use them. So I'm just going to change 2% into 0.02, which is a decimal. Okay. It wants me to figure out what this X value is, right? So that means, well, first of all, I need to do a little bit of work before I go into Minitab, right? What do I need to do? If I typed in 0.02 in the inverse cumulative function, will it give me something that makes sense? No, right? I have to figure out what the area to the left is first, right? So remember, step one, if you're given an area to the right, is to subtract from 1. 1 minus 0.02. I need to find the area to the left, which is 0.98. Now I can go in Minitab and figure out what's going on here, right? So why don't I just go ahead and do that? Okay. So I'm going to go click on calc, click on probability, click on inverse cumulative. And instead of the value of the 0.0 whatever, I'm going to put in 0.98. Okay. Now I'm not done yet because this isn't asking me for a z-score anymore. I'm asked to figure out what the actual x value is. So I need to go and change my mean and standard deviation to 115. Okay. So I'm going to click OK. And it gives me that value, 130.806. That's my answer. So whenever we're doing inverse, whatever pops up on Minitab is our final answer. And let me write this down. 3, 2, 1. My answer is the 130.806. All right. Any questions on what I did here? Okay, so I wish I did this in my last class. Let's just put this all together. I'm just going to go to the last page here and kind of just draw on the bottom. Okay. When we're doing any normal probability questions, there's two types of questions. There's the cumulative probability, and then there's the inverse cumulative, right? Okay. What questions is the cumulative asking me for? Well, we're given the x value and z-score, but it's asking us the probability. Yeah, yeah, you got it. So when you're doing the cumulative questions, you're being asked about the probability. Like, what is the probability, right? Okay. When you're given the inverse cumulative button, you're asked, okay, the question is really asking you, what's the x value or the z-score, right? Okay, so that's what you're trying to find. Okay. When you do the cumulative probabilities, the first thing you need to do is figure it out if it's like a less than, greater than, or not equal, or sorry, or in between question, right? So you have less than, you have, oh my gosh, in between, here we go. And then you have above, right? Okay. Whenever you do these, you basically plug things into Minitab no matter what. And then after you do Minitab, you either subtract from 1 or subtract the 2 answers, right? So after Minitab, you'll go ahead and either subtract the 2 or you'll do 1 minus the answer. Okay. Now, inverse cumulative, I'm actually never going to ask you an in-between question, but you could get a less than question or an above question. Okay. If you're given a less than question, you don't really have to do anything. But if you're given an above question, you're going to subtract from 1, the probability, but you're not going to do that after you type into Minitab. You're doing this before Minitab. Okay, so there's a lot of different options floating around here. The first thing I would do when I do a question is first figure out if it's a cumulative or inverse cumulative question, right? Remember, that's kind of like, oh my gosh, it depends on what the question is, right? So if it's asking about the probability cumulative, if it's asking about the x value z-score, it's inverse cumulative. That's the first thing you need to figure out. The next thing you need to figure out is, okay, is it a less than, in between, or above question? Or is it a less than or above question? Because that depends on, well, that tells you what you're going to do next, okay? The last thing I want you to keep in mind is the difference between an x value and a z-score. That does change what you type in for both of these, right? If you're given a z-score, the mean has to be 0 and the standard deviation has to be 1. The X value is dependent on the question. Okay, so hopefully that helps you with these questions. I think it just takes a little bit of practice getting used to what to click. But keeping this organized in my head does take a little bit of space. So how about this? If you go to example number 3, I have a couple of questions for you to try. They're all jumbled together. So this is kind of like a test, right? So on a test, I'm going to give you a question. You have to figure out what button to click. You have to figure out what to do. Just write some answers up here so you can kind of check to see if you're on the right track. I'm not going to tell you how to do them. They want to hit on B. Yeah, let's go to B real quick. Okay. So this one's asking for an X value. So do you think it's inverse or cumulative? Definitely inverse, right? So I'm definitely going to use inverse here. Okay, so inverse cumulative. And if it's an X value, that means I'm dealing with a mean of 527 and standard deviation of 112, right? So the mean is 527, the standard deviation is 112. Okay, so I want to do 0.35 and below, which if I were to draw that, it's probably like a smaller probability and I'm shading to the left, right? So if you go to Minitab here, let me just show you what I would type out. Oh, I gotta go to Minitab myself. Here we go. All right, so calc, probability, and inverse. Under the value, I would type the 0.35. For the mean, I would do 527. Standard deviation, I do 112. And you should get 483.844. And remember, with inverse, the answer on Minitab is literally your answer. You don't have to do anything to it. So that's literally what your answer is. You're welcome. I feel like these questions just get so confusing because like there's 15 billion different things you could do for each one.